So, here we are at the end of 2 very inspiring days. I think we are all going home with much to think about and much to reflect upon. And I also invite you to make use of the opportunity that all the talks that you have heard these 2 days are available on the YouTube channel of the ITI, so you can actually review them and reflect on them. I would like to conclude this summit on education in an effort to try to bring together the many excellent thoughts and ideas that were presented yesterday and today. And I will certainly not do any justice to the great speakers and panelists that we have had these days. And so I will try to summarize it in my own words and add some of my own thoughts to it. And I'm happy to see some of my students here, because we actually, during the first term, had our course on Introduction to Liberal Arts. So you will recognize some of the ideas that I am presenting here. But I would like to start telling you a story which I think illustrates very well much of what we have been talking about these 2 days. I'm not giving you his name because he will probably, the person about whom I'm talking, would probably not like me to share his name, but those of you who work with me will recognize who I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about a Syrian refugee boy who 7 years ago came to us in the Schola Thomas Morus, together with his younger brother, and did not speak a word of German, not a single word of German. They are a Christian family who had to flee the violence and the war and the persecution in Syria that was taking place at the time. And our school decided to accept him and his brother into our program. And in a couple of weeks, this young man will be doing his matura, the final part of his matura, so the oral part. He already passed the written part. And he will do the oral part of his matura without in any way him being given certain advantages because of his status. He actually not only went through the process of learning a new language and learning all the other languages that he needed to learn in the school. He even went through the very challenging exercise of the so-called Zulassungsprüfungen, so the entry exams before even being able to get into the final exams, what we call the matura. And this is 22 exams before the matura, 22 exams over the whole of what has been learned in the upper 4 years of high school. And in a couple of weeks, he will do his oral part of the final exam and will then graduate. Why am I telling you this story? Because it's one of the stories in my over 25 years of education that inspires me the most until today. Because here I see at work much of what we have been discussing those 2 days. I see that education is in first instance not so much, it is also, but not in first instance primary, about the information we impart, as we heard this beautiful Jewish wisdom that was shared with us. But it's really about character, and character being built on the basis of the relationship between the teacher and the student, between the teacher and the pupil. Because it was because of the character of this young man, his dedication, but equally the dedication of the teachers who made the effort of building a relationship with this young man and through this relationship imparting knowledge and supporting him, that he has accomplished this amazing feat. And whenever people complain to me, students or young people complain to me about how difficult school or university is and how tough it is and how much we have to learn, I always like to speak about this young man, because he is proof of what we have been speaking about, how education is the combination, in primary instance, of character and dedication. Character and dedication from both the student and the teacher. So I wanted to start with this story to make it real, because it's very important that we don't leave this summit after 2 days going home thinking we've heard many beautiful ideas, it's all very nice and we'll philosophize about it, but then we just go on to normal business on Monday and day after day start forgetting what we have learned here. What our hope is with these 2 days as you go home is that you actually bring very concrete ideas into action in your environment, especially all those of you who are in education or who are being educated. And in fact, we're all being educated. And so I would like to start here after this story with another quote from Pope Francis as he spoke at a university in Budapest last Sunday. And he was speaking here, in fact, about the symbolic meaning of the Donau, the beautiful river that streams through Austria and through Hungary, amongst others, through Vienna and also through Budapest. He says, "Culture is in some sense like a great river. It runs through and connects various areas of life and history, enabling us to navigate in this world and to embrace distant countries and lands. It nurtures the mind, satisfies the soul, and fosters the growth of society. The very word culture comes from the verb to cultivate. Knowledge entails a constant planting of seeds that take root in the soil of reality and bear rich fruit. The soil of reality. That's another word we have heard a lot during these days, how education has to be rooted in reality. And so I gave the title to these concluding thoughts, I gave the title, The Congested Crossroads of Education, What Are Our Sources? So the first question I would like to briefly answer to you is, why is the crossroads of education on which we find ourselves, why is it congested? And I think, and we've heard a lot of that during these 2 days, I think if one very briefly summarizes it in my own words, there is too much traffic on this crossroads going on of 3 things I would like to identify. The first is ideologies, the latest ideologies, the latest fashion, the latest orthodoxies. What some, whether it's the media or whoever, decides should now be the latest acceptable thought and acceptable thinking and ideas. So ideologies is one issue of the congested crossroads. And it's really hampering education, because education is not and should not be about implementing ideologies, as we have heard so many times during these days. The second element that is congesting these crossroads is the constant reforms. We heard some excellent comments about that also during the first part of yesterday. In this country, like in many other European countries, I would say also in the United States, the past decades, we have seen constant reforms in education. There's a funny story of a real pro in education and somebody who has been very often here in Trumau and who has played an active role in the school. His name is Dr. Walli, Hofrat Walli. He was the director of the Schotten Gymnasium. And he likes to make the comment that as directors in his time, they had a special drawer for the reforms. And so when the newest reform came in, they would put it in a drawer, waiting it to collect dust until the next reform would come along and everybody would have already forgotten the previous reform. And I always find this a very fitting description because the amount of reforms is actually quite extraordinary. And the question that is too little asked, of course, is what is the purpose of all these reforms? And I was very happy that even some of the political representatives here yesterday also pointed out this problem. And the third issue that is congesting this crossroads, and we also heard a lot of important insights into that, is the technology paradigm, or better to say technology paradigms, is that technology, as we heard, should be at the service of the human being and not the human being at the service of technology. So finding the right way to implement technology, that it is actually a human implementation, that it serves humanity. And the interesting thing is that all these 3 points, ideologies, reforms, and technology paradigms, they're all competing for attention and the implementation of their ideas, leading very often to an actually completely forgetting about what really education should be about. And the interesting thing is also that all these 3 claim certitudes. However, what is needed in education is learning how to think, learning to listen to the language of being through nature and reason, and, as we heard previously, through recognizing the transcendence of human life. If we lose the aspect of transcendence in human life, and we lose that in education, we actually lose our access to the people who need to be educated, including ourselves. And thirdly, what education needs is learning to have an ordered intellectual discourse, also something we were discussing these days. This again requires virtues education and practice. I think specifically here of the virtues of patience, prudence, humility, and courage. It needs a training in rhetoric and debate, how to express and especially how to hold out disagreement. This is something that in our modern times with its constantly changing orthodoxies is something that especially young people find increasingly difficult. And that is the ability to hold out disagreement, to be actually able to deal with people you disagree with and actually have a discussion and a debate with them without immediately starting to call them names, which is something our modern society loves to do, and especially our media loves to do, is to call people names who are not following a certain narrative. You can just add the words to it. Somebody is ... phobe, or somebody is anti ... or pro ... It's very easy to fall into this sort of way, but that's not how education should work, because we should be able to hold out disagreement and have an ordered discourse, and maybe come to the point that we agree to disagree. And a third thing that this requires is, and that is another issue that was much discussed these days, reading, writing, And something that didn't get a lot of attention these days, but which I am discovering day by day as being important, working with hands. Working with our hands is really something have been discovering, especially during the past years, is something that is greatly lacking in our educational systems. And I actually found it very interesting to hear our first speaker yesterday speak about the history of why we've come, at least in this country, in the educational system that we are, which he even compared to a military structure where you're sitting for many hours, but especially young people between the ages of 14 and 18. I'm myself the father of a number of teenagers. Especially at this age, there's the need to work with one's hands, to move, to go out, to go into nature, to actually taste reality. Of course, under guidance. But this is really an aspect that really needs to be further developed. The time lacks now to go into that, but that's really something I would really like to look closer at. So what are our choices? That's the second part of the title of this concluding thoughts. What are our choices? What are our choices in the sense we are at this crossroads? Where to go? Which way to go? And I would like to answer this question by giving my own answers to these three questions that I presented to you yesterday morning at the opening of this summit. I gave you three questions. I wonder if anybody still remembers them. So I will repeat those questions, and then on the basis of some of my thoughts and what we have learned these 2 days, I will try to give some very incomplete answers, forgive me for that, but at least some thoughts for you to go. So the first question I asked was, what would be the most important task of education for men and for society? And I think a good answer to that would be to make visible, to bring out what is already present in a person, what he or she is meant to be. I loved the image that was given earlier today of the image of the midwife, the understanding of the midwife in education, who helps deliver. I found it a powerful image because it describes so well what education is meant to be. Education is not about creating something new ourselves. It's helping deliver something that is already there, and then helping put that human being in the world and find his or her place, find his or her vocation. Very powerful image, I found that. Now, how do we do that? Through strengthening individuality instead of uniformity. This is another real challenge of our current society, this enormous pressure for uniformity. So individuality instead of uniformity, and the capacity to live in community instead of in a world of atomization. We heard that in the excellent presentation where Hannah Arendt was referenced, who's an author that I myself have also spent a lot of time reading and writing about. So the capacity to live in community instead of in a world of atomization. So you see here, if you take that together, strengthening individuality instead of uniformity. At the same time and in the same movement, learning the capacity to live in community instead of in a world of atomization. Whilst once more learning the uplifting power of beauty. We had a beautiful presentation on that yesterday. The uplifting, and I would say even healing power of beauty. Now, Jacques Maritain, in his book, Education at the Crossroads, says it very simple. And in fact, this book, Education at the Crossroads, was in fact the inspiration for this conference and also for a series of videos we have made where we discuss this topic and that you can actually find on our YouTube channel. It's a series of videos where I am in conversation with various people in education about education at the crossroads. Jacques Maritain, in his beautiful book, Education at the Crossroads, says, very briefly, the education of man is a human awakening. This correlates very well with the image of the midwife. The education of man is a human awakening. And, he later goes on, what is of most importance in education, what is of most importance in educators themselves is a respect for the soul as well as for the body of the child, the sense of his or her innermost essence and his internal resources, and a sort of sacred and loving attention to his mysterious identity, which is a hidden thing that no techniques can reach. Here again, very beautiful, this reference to the machine. No techniques, no matter how helpful they may be in many ways, but no techniques are ever going to be able, also not artificial intelligence, which is the big story of the day, are never going to be able to give this sacred and loving attention to the mysterious identity of the human person, where the educator is the one called to help bring that out without imposing him or herself. So really, in the words of Jacques Maritain, education, true education, is an appeal to intelligence and free will. Let me go to the second question that I asked yesterday. Where in today's educational landscape do we see the biggest danger and the biggest challenge? And I would like to summarize that briefly in 3 brief word combinations. I see the biggest challenge, and we heard also these 2 days a lot about that. I see them in bureaucracy over pedagogy, process, or better to say processes, over persons, and economy over human ecology. So let me repeat that. The challenges. Bureaucracy over pedagogy, processes over persons, and economy over human ecology. This leads ultimately to the dehumanization of education. So what then, knowing this challenge? Again, Jacques Maritain. He says, the prime goal of education is the conquest of internal and spiritual freedom to be achieved by the individual person. The conquest of internal and spiritual freedom to be achieved by the individual person. Again, do you see this focus that all these great minds have on the individual person? Not the egocentric person. That's not an egocentric person. But it's the respect of the uniqueness of each individual human being as created in the image and likeness of God. That's the starting point. Her liberation through knowledge, wisdom, goodwill, and love, Maritain says. Thus, if you ask, what is the challenge? In other words, it is to overcome in our educational systems all structures and influences that seek to force the educated into a straitjacket of how one is allowed to think and what one is allowed to say or write. I think this is absolutely essential in dealing with that challenge. We have to break down the systems or reform, but as I just said, reforms is not what we need. We have to break down the systems and structures and influences that try to push the educated into this straitjacket, because we can never attain that inner freedom that education should be all about. That is why thought crimes, about which George Orwell writes, and I think that we're all very familiar with tendencies in today's society, that's why thought crimes are the ultimate killer of human flourishing. In fact, Pope Francis last Sunday in Budapest called this, and I quote, an oppression based on the imposition of a consensus. Brilliant sentence. The oppression based on the imposition of a consensus. A society that acts and does as if there is a consensus on something simply by using the sheer force of certain institutions that there are, whether it's the media or whether it's social media or whether it's educational institutions, trying to impose something of a consensus that is not really a consensus. This brings me to the third question and the last question. And that was the question to you: when today you would be appointed education minister, what would be your first priority or decision? This is a hard question, but I love the question because it makes it real and concrete what we have been talking about. And actually, it was only this morning that the answer came to me. And the answer is this: reintroducing into education the principle of subsidiarity, which is a principle deeply rooted in Catholic social teaching, as you know. That's the first thing I would do. Reintroducing in education the principle of subsidiarity. Let me explain to you a little bit how that would work. We need to work on reducing the role of the state and of economic and ideological interests in education. Instead, allowing the teacher, the professor, the school and the university, through that relationship that we have been speaking about with its students, to seek the most effective way to awaken the individual human being to his or her calling in life and cultivate the mind and the soul. So, to put it in other words, depoliticization and rehumanization of education. And as I said before, we can't go into this deep. One of the things I would do there is reduce the sitting hours for the young people. Don't know how that's going to work, but that's something I would find very important. Concrete. What should we be doing? Concretely, this means discarding as much bureaucracy and paperwork as possible. And by the way, I'm speaking here not really from anything else than out of very practical, both as a rector of this university, as well as leading the Catholic high school. In my interactions, one of the most often heard complaints I hear from colleagues in leadership positions in education is exactly this: the bureaucracy that is endless, the paperwork that is endless, the endless new rules and regulations that keep teachers and leaders of educational institutions from actually doing that what they are called to do and what we've been discussing these days. So we have to be discarding as much bureaucracy and paperwork as possible. And that discarding actually has to happen from top down, starting with a major reduction of competencies of ministries of education the world over. Other than what I think will still be necessary and good, a general legal framework and basic quality standards. I'm not against ministries of education. I just think that a lot more of their competency should be brought back where subsidiarity requires it to be on the levels where it can best be enacted. So in a way, if you look at it in a concrete way, I've had the privilege to spend a lot of time in educational institutions, both in Europe and the US, and I think there's a certain middle way that can be found, because where in certain ways European educational systems are mostly over-regulated, in the United States there is generally much more possibility for enterprise also in education, in the sense of private initiatives in education. And I think a middle way could be found where this principle of subsidiarity is really respected. So, I come to my conclusion. And by the way, this last point, of course, requires a lot more thinking, so we can't go into it in depth. But I think there's always a lot we can learn by looking and observing different educational systems. So what are our choices? I think our choices are clear. I again would like to use the words of Francis because they are so recent and so to the point. He said, "Culture truly preserves and defends our humanity. It immerses us in contemplation and shapes persons who are not prey to the fashions of the moment, but solidly grounded in the reality of things." Let's see here the word reality, solidly grounded in the reality of things. I think if there's one thing that our culture is losing rapidly, and thus also affects education, is this being grounded in reality, because we get so carried away with all sorts of new ideologies, new ideas that are promoted from this or that direction and often have no source in reality whatsoever. And then he goes on to say, true lovers of culture, in fact, never feel entirely satisfied. They always experience a healthy interior restlessness and plunge with humility into the mystery of life. I think if we can bring that about in our universities and in our schools, this healthy interior restlessness and this willingness to plunge with humility into the mystery of life, which means that we're never done learning, and which, by the way, also means, especially in relation to some phrases we've been hearing in the past 3 years, that science is never settled. There is no such thing as settled science, because science is our way as human beings to try to come closer to the truth and to the reality of what it means to be human. And that's a process that will go on as long as humanity walks around on this earth. But really this healthy interior restlessness. So education then is the art of asking. That's what I love so much about the Jewish tradition. And it's this art of asking questions. A good rabbi never gives an answer, but asks the next question. Yeah? Education then, so, is the art of asking, the art of accepting, yet at the same time delving into the mysterious reality of life. A journey that never ends, and that each teacher, in the beautiful words of Cardinal Schönborn this morning, that each teacher is called to serve and not to master. And with these words, I would like to leave you. Thank you.